Emma Willows clutched the tear-stained letter in her trembling hands as the harsh Colorado wind whipped through her chestnut hair. The devastating truth of her husband's betrayal, laid bare in his own handwriting, he had abandoned her for another woman, taking their life savings and leaving her alone on their struggling homestead in the unforgiving frontier of 1877. Emma had been a bride of just 2 years when Thomas Willows vanished. She'd thought nothing of it when he'd said he needed to travel to Denver for supplies and to meet with a banker about a loan for their small ranch. 3 days had stretched to a week, then 2, until finally the letter arrived by way of a passing mail carrier. The words were cold, detached Thomas confessing he'd fallen for a wealthy widow in Denver and was heading east with her, taking every penny they'd saved. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Emma stumbled back into the modest cabin she'd once shared with the man who'd promised to love her forever. At 23, she was alone in the wilderness with winter approaching, no money, and a property she couldn't possibly maintain by herself. "You fool," she whispered to herself, collapsing onto a wooden chair by the kitchen table. "You blind, trusting fool." Emma allowed herself one day of tears, one day to feel the crushing weight of betrayal and abandonment. But on the second morning, she rose before dawn with a new resolve burning in her chest. The Willows homestead, her homestead, now sat on 80 acres of land that Thomas had claimed through the Homestead Act. They'd worked the land together for 2 years, planting crops and raising a small herd of cattle. It wasn't much, but it was something, and Emma would be damned if she'd let Thomas take that from her too. The cruel reality, however, set in quickly. The barn needed repairs before winter, the cattle needed tending, and the last of their crop needed harvesting. Work that had been challenging for 2 was nearly impossible for 1. Emma worked from sunrise to sunset, her hands blistering and bleeding, her back aching, but it wasn't enough. After a week of struggling alone, she knew she needed help or she would lose everything. Sweetwater was the nearest town, a small but growing settlement about 5 miles from her homestead. Emma hadn't been there since Thomas left, too proud to face the townsfolk and their inevitable questions. But necessity overcame pride, and on a crisp October morning, she hitched her mare to the wagon and made the journey into town. Sweetwater had one main street lined with the essential businesses of frontier life. A general store, a saloon, a small hotel, a blacksmith, and a few other establishments. Emma guided her wagon toward the general store, hoping to purchase necessary supplies on credit until she could sell some of her cattle. She was tying her horse to the hitching post when a commotion from the saloon caught her attention. The batwing doors burst open, and a man stumbled out, clearly pushed with some force. He landed hard in the dirt road, followed by the imposing figure of a man Emma recognized as the saloon owner, Frank Turner. "I told you last time, Wilson, your credit's no good here. Pay your debts or don't come back," Turner shouted before disappearing back into the saloon. The man in the dirt slowly got to his feet, dusting himself off with as much dignity as he could muster. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. His clothes were worn but clean denims, a faded blue shirt, and a weathered leather vest. When he looked up, Emma was struck by eyes as blue as a summer sky. He caught her staring and tipped his hat with a wry smile. "Not my finest moment, madam." Emma quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught watching his humiliation. She hurried into the general store, but not before hearing someone call out to the man. "Hey, Nash, need a job? Jensen's looking for hands to help with his cattle drive." Inside the store, Emma approached the counter where Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, greeted her with surprise. "Emma Willows, we haven't seen you in weeks. How are you faring, dear, and where's that husband of yours?" The question stabbed at Emma's heart, but she forced a polite smile. "I'm managing, Mrs. Peterson. As for Thomas, he's gone." Mrs. Peterson's expression shifted to one of concern. "Gone? Whatever do you mean?" Emma swallowed hard. "He left me, ran off with another woman and took our savings." The older woman's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, you poor thing." I always thought Thomas seemed a bit flighty, but to abandon his wife, it's unconscionable. "Yes, well, I didn't come for sympathy," Emma said firmly. "I need supplies, and I was hoping you might extend me some credit until I can sell some cattle." Mrs. Peterson's face fell. "Oh, Emma." "I wish we could, but with the railroad delays affecting our shipments, Mr. Peterson has been very strict about no new credit accounts." Desperation flared in Emma's chest. "Please, Mrs. Peterson, I just need enough to get through until I can bring some cattle to market." "I'm truly sorry, dear." "Perhaps if you had someone to vouch for you." The bell above the door jingled, and Emma turned to see the man from earlier Nash entering the store. He nodded politely to both women before heading to a shelf of tools. Mrs. Peterson leaned closer to Emma, lowering her voice. "That's Nash Barrett. Been in these parts about 6 months. Works odd jobs, mostly for the ranches around here. Keeps to himself, but he's honest work from what I hear." Emma barely registered the information, her mind racing with how she would manage without supplies. She thanked Mrs. Peterson and turned to leave, fighting back tears of frustration. Outside, Emma leaned against her wagon, taking deep breaths to calm herself. She had a little money, a few dollars she'd kept hidden in a jar that Thomas hadn't found, but it wouldn't buy much. As she was contemplating her options, a voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse me, madam, couldn't help but overhear your predicament in there." Emma turned to find Nash Barrett standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand. "It's not polite to eavesdrop, Mr. Barrett," she said stiffly. "Nash, please, and you're right, it isn't. But these walls are thin and I wasn't trying to listen." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "I heard you need help with your ranch." Emma straightened her spine. "I can manage my own affairs." Nash nodded, his expression serious. "No doubt, but even the strongest person can use an extra pair of hands sometimes. I'm looking for work, and it sounds like you need a hired hand." "I can't pay you," Emma admitted bluntly. "That's the whole problem. Room and board would be enough until you sell your cattle. I'm good with livestock, and I can fix just about anything that's broken." He gestured to his face with a self-deprecating smile. "Despite appearances, I'm not much of a drinker. That was about a debt I owed from a poker game before I swore off cards." Emma studied him warily. He appeared sincere, and she desperately needed help, but she'd just been devastated by trusting a man. "Why would you work for just room and board?" Nash shrugged. "Winter's coming. A warm place to sleep and regular meals beats sleeping in the livery stable or camping out. And I've been moving from job to job. Might be nice to stay in one place for a while." Emma considered his offer. Having a man around the homestead would certainly make things easier, and if he was willing to work for just food and shelter until she could sell some cattle, it might be her only option. "I won't have a strange man living in my house," she said firmly. "The barn would be fine." "I've slept in worse places." Emma took a deep breath. 1 month, you work for 1 month, help me get the place ready for winter and bring some cattle to market, then we'll see about actual wages." Nash extended his hand. "Deal, Mrs. Willows, Emma Willows." She hesitated before shaking his hand briefly. "And I expect a full day's work, Mr. Barrett. I won't tolerate laziness. I wouldn't expect anything less." He glanced at the general store. "Now, what supplies did you need? I have a little money saved." "I won't take your money," Emma said sharply. "Consider it an advance on my future wages, then. You can't run a ranch without supplies, and I can't work without tools." His logic was sound, and Emma found herself reluctantly agreeing. With Nash's money, they purchased essential supplies: flour, coffee, sugar, nails, a new saw blade, and a few other necessities. As they loaded the wagon, Emma found herself studying her new hired hand. There was something reassuring about his quiet competence, the way he efficiently organized the supplies and secured them for the journey. The ride back to the homestead was mostly silent. Emma kept her eyes on the road, acutely aware of the stranger beside her. She'd never been alone with a man other than Thomas since her marriage, and the impropriety of her situation wasn't lost on her. But survival trumped propriety, and Emma had always been practical. "That's it up ahead," she said as they approached the homestead. The modest cabin sat on a gentle slope, with a barn and corral nearby. Fields stretched out on one side, and a small creek ran along the property line. It wasn't grand, but it was more than many had in the West. Nash surveyed the property with an appraising eye. "Good water source." "Land looks fertile. How many cattle do you have?" 26 head, plus 2 milk cows and a bull, 3 horses including my mare, half a dozen chickens. Emma pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. "The north fence needs repair, the barn roof leaks, and the cattle need to be rounded up and checked before winter." Nash nodded, already assessing the work. "We should start with the barn roof. No point fixing fences if we don't have a sound place to keep the animals." Emma was slightly taken aback by his immediate understanding of priorities. "Yes, that makes sense." They unloaded the supplies, and Emma showed Nash to the barn where he could store his few possessions: a bedroll, a small bag of clothes, and a worn saddle. "There's clean straw in the loft." "It's not much, but it's dry," she said. "It's more than enough. Thank you." Nash set his things down and turned to her. "If it's all right with you, Mrs. Willows, I'd like to check the barn roof now, see what we're dealing with." Emma nodded, surprised by his eagerness to begin work immediately. "I'll prepare some supper. We can discuss the rest of the work then." As she walked back to the cabin, Emma found herself feeling a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Relief that she now had help with the overwhelming work ahead, and anxiety about having a stranger, a man, living on her property. But there was something about Nash Barrett that put her slightly at ease. Perhaps it was his straightforward manner, or the way he spoke to her with respect rather than pity. Inside the cabin, Emma busied herself preparing a simple meal of beans, biscuits, and the last of the summer's preserved vegetables. As she worked, she caught herself glancing out the window toward the barn, where Nash was already on the roof, examining the damaged sections. There was something comforting about seeing someone else working on her homestead, sharing the burden that had felt so crushing when she'd been alone. By the time supper was ready, Nash had removed the damaged shingles and was measuring the area that needed repair. Emma called him in from the porch, and he appeared a few minutes later, having washed his hands and face at the pump. "The damage isn't as bad as it could be," he reported as he sat at the table where Emma had set his plate. "We'll need to replace about 20 shingles and reinforce a few beams, but I can have it done in a day or two." Emma nodded, sitting across from him. "That's good news. I was worried the whole roof might need replacing." They ate in awkward silence for a few minutes before Nash spoke again. "May I ask how long you've had this place?" Emma hesitated, then decided there was no harm in simple conversation. "Almost 3 years. My husband," she faltered slightly on the word, "Thomas and I came west from Missouri. He filed the claim under the Homestead Act. We've been working the land since then." Nash seemed to sense her discomfort. "It's good land. With proper care, you could double your herd in a few years. If I can keep the place," Emma admitted. "Without Thomas, I'm not sure how I'll manage long term." "One day at a time," Nash said simply. "Fix what needs fixing, tend what needs tending. The rest will follow." There was a wisdom in his words that surprised Emma. "You sound like you've had experience with difficult situations." A shadow crossed Nash's face. "Everyone out here has their story, Mrs. Willows. Most of us are running to something or from something." "And which are you doing, Mr. Barrett?" He met her eyes with a directness that was unsettling. "Both, I suspect, same as most folks." Emma didn't press further. Everyone was entitled to their privacy, and she certainly wasn't eager to share the details of her own situation. After supper, Nash thanked her for the meal and returned to the barn, leaving Emma alone with her thoughts. As she washed the dishes, Emma found herself thinking about Nash Barrett. He was clearly capable and hardworking. He'd accomplished more in a few hours than she could have in days. But he was still a stranger, and trusting a stranger was what had gotten her into this predicament in the first place. Thomas had been charming and full of promises when she'd met him, sweeping her off her feet with tales of the fortune they'd make out west. She'd believed every word, only to be left abandoned and betrayed. Emma resolved to be more cautious this time. Nash Barrett might be her employee for now, but she would keep her guard up and her heart firmly closed. The next morning, Emma woke at dawn as usual, but to her surprise, Nash was already up and working. She could hear the sound of hammering from the barn, and when she stepped onto the porch with her coffee, she saw that he had already made significant progress on the roof. Throughout the day, Emma tended to her usual chores, feeding the chickens, milking the cows, and working in the small vegetable garden that provided much of their food. Occasionally, she would glance toward the barn, watching as Nash moved efficiently across the roof, replacing damaged shingles and reinforcing weak spots. By mid-afternoon, he had completed the roof repairs and moved on to fixing the broken stall doors inside the barn. Emma was impressed despite herself. Thomas had always complained about how much work needed doing, yet Nash had accomplished more in one day than Thomas had in weeks. As the sun began to set, Emma called Nash for supper. He appeared promptly, again having washed up first, his dark hair damp and his face clean-shaven. "I finished the roof and the stall doors," he reported as he sat down. "Tomorrow I'll check the fences and see what needs mending there." "Thank you," Emma said, genuinely grateful. "The work you've done today, it would have taken me weeks on my own." Nash accepted the plate she offered. "It's what you hired me for. Even so, I appreciate your diligence." They ate in a silence that was slightly less awkward than the previous evening. Emma found herself studying Nash when he wasn't looking. There was a quietness to him that was different from most men she'd known. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence with idle chatter or boastful stories. Instead, he seemed content to simply be present, focusing on his meal and occasionally glancing around the cabin with observant eyes. "Your home is well built," he commented after a while. "Solid construction, good craftsmanship." "Thomas hired men from town to help build it," Emma explained. "He always wanted everything to be just so." Nash nodded. "He had good taste in land, at least. This is prime property." The mention of Thomas sent a pang through Emma's heart, but it wasn't as sharp as before. Perhaps it was the presence of someone else in her home, or perhaps it was simply time beginning its healing work. After supper, Nash excused himself to check on the horses, and Emma found herself standing at the window, watching as he moved through the twilight toward the corral. There was something about his tall, lean figure moving confidently through her property that gave her a strange sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas left. "Don't be a fool twice," she whispered to herself, turning away from the window. Nash Barrett was her employee, nothing more. She couldn't afford to let her guard down again. The days fell into a rhythm as October deepened toward November. Each morning, Nash would be up before dawn, tending to the animals and tackling the day's work. Emma continued her own chores, and they would cross paths throughout the day, working separately but toward the same goal of preparing the homestead for winter. Nash repaired all the fences, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, split enough firewood to last through the coldest months, and even fixed the leaking roof of the cabin itself. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal, their conversations gradually becoming less strained as they grew accustomed to each other's company. Emma learned that Nash had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had lost everything during the Civil War. He'd been drifting ever since, working on ranches across the West, picking up skills along the way. He didn't volunteer much more than that, and Emma didn't ask. She, in turn, shared little pieces of her own story, how she'd been teaching school in Missouri when she met Thomas, how they'd decided to seek their fortune in the West, how she'd learned to adapt to frontier life. What she didn't share was the pain of Thomas's betrayal, the crushing sense of abandonment she still felt in the quiet hours of the night. But sometimes, When Nash looked at her with those clear blue eyes, she had the unsettling feeling that he saw it anyway. 2 weeks after Nash's arrival, they decided it was time to round up the cattle. Some had wandered to the far reaches of the property, and they needed to be brought closer to the barn for winter. It would be Emma's first time riding out with Nash, and she was both anxious and eager to see how he would handle the task. They set out at dawn, each on horseback. Emma rode her mare, Sadie, while Nash rode the gelding, Buck, that had been Thomas's horse. The morning was crisp and clear, the mountains in the distance capped with early snow. The cattle usually graze along the creek this time of year, Emma explained as they rode. But some might have wandered up toward the north ridge. Nash nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape. We'll start by the creek and work our way north then. No point climbing the ridge if we don't have to. They found most of the herd exactly where Emma had predicted, grazing peacefully along the creek. Nash demonstrated an easy confidence with the animals, gently guiding them together without startling them. Emma was impressed by his skill, but tried not to show it. After all, this was what she was paying him for. They had rounded up 20 of the cattle and were herding them back toward the barn when Nash suddenly raised his hand, signaling Emma to stop. "There's something in those trees," he said quietly, nodding toward a copse of pines about 50 yards away. Emma squinted, following his gaze. At first she saw nothing, but then a shadow moved among the trees. "A bear?" "No," Nash's voice was tight. "Men, 3 of them watching us." Emma's heart began to race. Strangers on her property could mean trouble. Rustlers and outlaws weren't uncommon in these parts, preying on isolated homesteads. "What should we do?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Act normal, keep moving the herd but angled away from them. I'll circle around behind them." "No," Emma grabbed his arm. "Don't leave me alone." Nash's expression softened slightly. "I won't let anything happen to you, Mrs. Willows, but we need to find out who they are and what they want." Before Emma could protest further, the decision was made for them. 3 riders emerged from the trees, moving slowly toward them. As they drew closer, Emma's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the man in the lead, Curtis Reed, a local rancher who had been trying to buy her land since she and Thomas first arrived. "Mrs. Willows," Reed called out as he approached, his voice falsely pleasant. "And who's this?" "I heard Thomas had run off, but I didn't know you'd found yourself a replacement so quickly." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Nash spoke before she could. "Nash Barrett, I work for Mrs. Willows." His voice was polite but cool, and Emma noticed how he'd positioned his horse slightly in front of hers, a subtle protective gesture. Reed was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a florid face and small, calculating eyes. He ran the largest ranch in the area and was known for his ruthless business practices. The 2 men with him were clearly hired hands, rough-looking fellows who kept their hands near their holstered guns. "Well now, that's interesting," Reed said, looking between them. "A woman alone running a ranch with just 1 hired hand must be difficult." "We manage," Emma said stiffly. "What brings you onto my property, Mr. Reed?" Reed smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly, checking in. Times are hard, and I heard about your situation. I wanted to renew my offer to buy your land. Given your circumstances, I'm willing to be generous." Emma straightened in her saddle. "My circumstances haven't changed the value of my land, Mr. Reed. It wasn't for sale when Thomas was here, and it's not for sale now." Reed's smile faltered. "Be reasonable, Mrs. Willows. Winter's coming. You can't possibly manage this place on your own, even with 1 hired hand. My offer won't stand forever." "Then it will have to fall," Nash said calmly. "Mrs. Willows has made her position clear." Reed's eyes narrowed as he studied Nash more carefully. "You look familiar, Barrett. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so," Nash replied evenly. Reed stared at him a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, Mrs. Willows, think about my offer. You know where to find me when you change your mind." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Good day to you both." They watched as Reed and his men rode away, disappearing over a rise in the land. He's been after this property since we arrived, Emma explained once they were alone again. Thomas always said it was because of the water rights. The creek runs through our land before reaching his. Nash nodded thoughtfully. Water's more valuable than gold out here, but I don't trust a man who tries to intimidate a woman alone. Emma glanced at him, surprised by the edge in his voice. Thank you for standing with me. Nash met her eyes, his expression serious. I told you I'd work for you, Mrs. Willows. That includes protecting what's yours. Something in his gaze made Emma's heart beat faster, and she quickly looked away. We should get these cattle back to the barn. It'll be dark soon. They continued their work in silence, but Emma found herself sneaking glances at Nash as they rode. For the first time, she wondered about the man behind the quiet competence. What had brought him to Sweetwater? Why was he alone? And why did she feel so strangely safe in his presence, despite barely knowing him? That night, after supper, Emma sat by the fire, mending a tear in one of her work dresses. Nash had excused himself to check on the animals one last time, as was his habit, before retiring to the barn for the night. The encounter with Reed had left her unsettled, bringing home just how vulnerable her position was. A woman alone in the West was seen as easy prey, regardless of her determination or capability. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Nash standing there, his expression grave. Mrs. Willows, I thought you should know there are riders circling the property. I can't be sure, but they might be Reed's men. Emma's blood ran cold. What do they want? To frighten you, most likely. Make you feel unsafe so you'll sell. What should we do? Nash's jaw tightened. I'll stay in the cabin tonight. Keep watch. Emma hesitated. Having a man stay in her home overnight was highly improper, but the alternative was potentially more dangerous. I'll take the chair, Nash added, sensing her discomfort. I've slept in worse places. Finally, Emma nodded. All right, thank you. Nash brought his rifle from the barn and positioned the chair near the window where he could see both the front approach and the barn. Emma provided him with a blanket, then retreated to her small bedroom, leaving the door slightly ajar in case there was trouble. Sleep evaded her that night. She lay awake, listening to the occasional creak of the chair as Nash shifted position, and the low, reassuring sound of his breathing in the other room. There was something strangely comforting about his presence, a sense of security she hadn't felt since Thomas left, perhaps even before that, if she was honest with herself. Toward dawn, Emma must have finally dozed off because she awoke to the smell of coffee and the sound of movement in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Nash at the stove, frying bacon in a skillet. I hope you don't mind, he said, glancing up as she entered. Thought you might appreciate a hot breakfast after a restless night. Emma was touched by the gesture. Thank you. Did anything happen? Riders came by twice, just circling, watching. They didn't approach. Nash transferred the bacon to a plate. They're trying to unnerve you. It's working, Emma admitted, sitting at the table. But I won't sell. This land is all I have left. Nash placed the plate of bacon in front of her, along with a cup of coffee. I admire your determination, Mrs. Willows. Not many would stand their ground like you are. His words warmed her more than they should have. Please call me Emma. If you're going to be sleeping in my home to protect me from rustlers, we might as well use first names. A smile touched Nash's lips, transforming his serious face. Emma, then, and I'm Nash, as you know. After breakfast, they discussed their options. Reed was unlikely to give up easily, and with winter approaching, they needed to focus on final preparations rather than watching for trouble. We need to get the remaining cattle rounded up and bring them closer to the barn, Nash said. And I want to reinforce the doors on the cabin and barn, make it harder for anyone to break in, Emma nodded. I also need to take some cattle to market soon. We need money for winter supplies. I could take them, Nash offered. You'd be safer staying here. No, Emma said firmly. This is my ranch. I'll go to market myself. Nash studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm coming with you. We'll take 10 head that should bring enough for supplies without depleting your breeding stock too much. They spent the next 2 days rounding up the remaining cattle and selecting the ones to take to market. Nash was patient with the animals, never raising his voice or using unnecessary force. Emma found herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way the sun brought out golden highlights in his dark hair, the way his hands moved with gentle confidence as he guided the cattle. On the morning they were to leave for market, Emma rose early to prepare food for the journey. The cattle drive to Sweetwater wasn't long, but they would need to stay overnight to complete the sale and purchase supplies. As she packed bread, cheese, and dried meat, Emma couldn't help feeling nervous about spending a night in town with Nash. People would talk, no doubt, but she had little choice. Nash appeared at the cabin door just as she was finishing her preparations. "The cattle are ready to move," he reported. "I've saddled the horses and loaded your bedroll on Buck." Emma nodded, suddenly self-conscious. She'd put on her best dress for the trip to town, a simple blue cotton with a white collar, and had pinned her hair up neatly beneath her bonnet. Nash's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, but he said nothing about her appearance. The journey to Sweetwater was uneventful. They drove the cattle at a steady pace, with Nash taking the lead and Emma bringing up the rear. They spoke little, focused on the task at hand, but there was a comfortable ease between them that Emma found surprising. In just a few weeks, they had developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. When they reached Sweetwater in the early afternoon, they herded the cattle directly to the stockyard where the buyer, Mr. Jenkins, was waiting. Emma had sent word ahead through a passing neighbor that she would be bringing cattle to market. Jenkins was a fair man who had always dealt honestly with Emma and Thomas in the past. He examined the cattle carefully, then made an offer that was reasonable given the current market. "It's a fair price," Nash murmured to Emma as they stepped aside to discuss it. "Yes," she agreed. "And we need the money." They accepted Jenkins's offer, and Emma felt a surge of pride as he counted out the money into her hand. This was the first significant step she had taken toward independence since Thomas left, and it felt momentous. With the cattle sold and the money safely tucked away in her reticule, Emma and Nash headed to the general store to purchase winter supplies. "This time, Mrs." Peterson greeted Emma warmly, her eyes darting curiously between her and Nash. "Emma, dear, how wonderful to see you again. And Mr. Barrett, I see you found employment with Mrs. Willows." "Yes, madam," Nash replied politely. "I've been helping get the ranch ready for winter." "Mrs." Peterson's expression was knowing in a way that made Emma uncomfortable. "Well, isn't that fortunate for both of you? Now, what can I help you with today?" They purchased flour, sugar, coffee, beans, and other staples that would last through the winter months, along with lamp oil, matches, and a new axe head. Nash insisted on adding a few small luxuries: a bar of lavender soap for Emma, a packet of peppermint sticks, and a book of poetry by Tennyson that he'd noticed her admiring. "You don't need to spend your money on frivolities," Emma protested softly when Mrs. Peterson went to the back room for the soap. "It's not frivolous to have small comforts," Nash replied. "Winter's long out here. A book can make all the difference on a cold night." The thoughtfulness of his gesture touched Emma deeply. Thomas had rarely considered her personal desires, focusing instead on what he deemed necessary or practical. With their purchases loaded onto the wagon Nash had borrowed from the livery, they faced the question of where to spend the night. The cattle sale had taken longer than expected, and it was now too late to start back to the ranch. "The hotel has clean rooms," Nash suggested, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I can sleep in the livery with the horses if that would make you feel more at ease." Emma considered this. Having Nash stay at the livery would certainly be more proper, but after the encounter with Reed and his men, she was wary of being alone. "No," she decided. "We'll both stay at the hotel. Separate rooms, of course," she added quickly, feeling her cheeks warm. Nash nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course." The Sweetwater Hotel was a modest 2-story building with 10 rooms. The proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Holbrook raised her eyebrows slightly at Emma and Nash, but made no comment as she assigned them adjacent rooms at the end of the upstairs hallway. "Supper's served in the dining room at 6, she informed them. "Baths extra if you're interested." Emma decided to indulge in a bath, using some of her precious cattle money for the luxury of hot water and privacy. As she soaked in the copper tub, she found her thoughts drifting to Nash. He had been nothing but respectful and helpful since arriving at her ranch, yet there was something about him that intrigued her. A depth beneath his quiet exterior, perhaps, or the way his eyes sometimes held a sadness that matched her own. She chided herself for these thoughts. She had trusted too easily once before and paid dearly for it. Nash was her employee, nothing more, and she would do well to remember that. After her bath, Emma dressed in her blue dress again and made her way downstairs to the dining room. Nash was already there, seated at a small table by the window. He had clearly washed up as well, his dark hair was damp, and he wore a clean shirt she hadn't seen before. He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair with an old-world courtesy that surprised her. "You look refreshed," he commented as they sat down. "A hot bath can work wonders," Emma admitted. "Thank you for suggesting it." They ordered the house special beef stew with dumplings and ate in companionable silence for a while. The dining room was busy with other travelers and a few locals, creating a pleasant hum of conversation around them. "I was thinking," Nash said after a while, "about Reed and his interest in your land. It might be more than just the water rights." Emma looked up, curious. "What do you mean?" "There are rumors that the railroad might be extending a spur line through this area next year. If that's true, land values would increase significantly." Emma frowned. "Thomas never mentioned anything about a railroad. It's just a rumor at this point," Nash clarified. "But it would explain Reed's persistence." The idea was troubling. If Reed knew something about the railroad that she didn't, he might be trying to swindle her out of land that would soon be worth far more than his offers. "How do we find out if it's true?" she asked. Nash considered this. "The land office might have information, or the bank, but people aren't likely to share such things with a woman alone." "But they might talk to you," Emma realized. Nash nodded. "I could ask around tomorrow before we head back, discreetly, of course." "Thank you," Emma said, genuinely grateful. "You've already done so much more than I hired you for." Nash's blue eyes met hers across the table. "I gave you my word I'd help you keep your land. I intend to honor that." There was something in his gaze that made Emma's heart beat faster, a sincerity that was both reassuring and unsettling. She looked away, focusing on her stew. After supper, they retired to their respective rooms. Emma sat by the window for a long time, watching the stars appear in the clear mountain sky. She could hear Nash moving about in the adjacent room, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. There was something oddly comforting about knowing he was just on the other side of the wall. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast in the hotel dining room, Nash went to the land office while Emma purchased a few last-minute supplies. They agreed to meet at the livery at noon to begin the journey home. Emma was checking the wagon one final time when Nash arrived, his expression serious. "The rumors are true," he said without preamble. "The railroad is planning a spur line that would cross the corner of your property." The land agent was reluctant to confirm it, but he eventually admitted the surveys have already been done. Emma felt a surge of anger. "So Reed was trying to buy my land cheaply, knowing it would soon be worth much more." "Exactly. And I suspect he'll become more aggressive now that the plans are almost finalized." The journey back to the ranch was tense, both of them watchful for any sign of Reed or his men. But they arrived without incident, the homestead peaceful in the late afternoon sun. As they unloaded the supplies, Emma found herself thinking about Nash's revelation. The railroad's interest in her land could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on how she handled it. "If the railroad wants to cross my land, they'll have to pay for the right-of-way," she said as they carried the last of the supplies into the cabin. Nash nodded. "Yes, and handsomely too, But that's precisely why Reed wants your property. He'd be the one negotiating with the railroad, not you. Emma set down a sack of flour with more force than necessary. That snake, using my situation to try to cheat me. We won't let that happen, Nash said firmly. Emma looked up at him, struck by his use of we. When had her problem become their problem? And why did it feel so natural to have him standing beside her? A steady presence in the chaos of her life. The days that followed were busy with final preparations for winter. They brought the remaining cattle close to the barn, stored the last of the garden harvest, and made sure every building was weathertight. Nash continued to sleep in the barn, despite Emma's offer to let him use the small spare room in the cabin after the night in town. He insisted it was more proper this way, and Emma didn't press the issue, even though she sometimes found herself wishing for his presence in the evenings when the cabin felt too quiet and empty. November brought the first significant snowfall, transforming the landscape into a pristine white expanse. Emma stood on the porch one morning, watching as Nash chopped wood, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. There was something mesmerizing about the rhythm of his movements, the controlled strength as he swung the axe. So absorbed was she in watching him that Emma didn't immediately notice the riders approaching until Nash suddenly stopped, setting down the axe and reaching for the rifle he kept nearby. "Get inside," he called to her, his voice tense. Emma's heart raced as she recognized Curtis Reed leading a group of 5 men toward the cabin. This was no casual visit. It was a show of force. "I'm staying right here," she said, stepping down from the porch to stand beside Nash as the riders approached. Reed reined his horse to a stop a few yards away, his men fanning out behind him. His face was red from the cold, his expression smug. "Mrs. Willows," he greeted her with false cordiality, "I've come to discuss business." "There's no business between us, Mr. Reed," Emma replied coldly. "You're trespassing on my property." Reed's smile faded. "Now, that's not very neighborly, especially when I'm here to help you." "We don't need your help," Nash said, his rifle held casually but ready. Reed's eyes narrowed as he regarded Nash. "I wasn't talking to you, hired hand. This is between me and the widow." "I'm not a widow," Emma corrected him sharply. "And whatever you have to say, you can say in front of Mr. Barrett." Reed sighed dramatically. "Very well. I've come to make you a final offer on your property, Mrs. Willows. $5,000, cash in hand. That's more than double what it's worth, and you know it." The sum was indeed substantial, more than Reed had offered before. But now that Emma knew about the railroad, she understood why. "My land isn't for sale, Mr. Reed. Not at any price." Reed's face darkened. "Don't be a fool, woman. You can't manage this place on your own, and you know it. Winter's just beginning. What happens when the snow gets deep and the wolves come down from the mountains? What happens when your cattle start dying because you can't feed them properly?" "That's enough," Nash cut in, his voice low and dangerous. "Mrs. Willows has given you her answer. I suggest you respect it and leave." Reed turned his attention to Nash, his expression contemptuous. "And who's going to make me? You, 1 man against 6. "If necessary," Nash replied evenly. Emma felt fear grip her heart. Nash was skilled and strong, but he couldn't possibly stand against 6 armed men. "Please," she said, addressing Reed, "there's no need for violence. I simply won't sell my land. That's my right." Reed studied her for a long moment, then suddenly smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're right, of course. It is your right. For now." He tipped his hat mockingly. "We'll be seeing you again, Mrs. Willows, perhaps when you're more receptive to reason." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following closely behind. Emma let out a shaky breath once they were out of sight. "That was a threat, wasn't it?" Nash nodded grimly. "Yes, it was. He's not going to give up easily." "What do we do now?" Nash turned to her, his blue eyes intense. "We prepare, and we stay vigilant." Over the next few days, Nash worked tirelessly to fortify the homestead. He reinforced the doors and windows of both the cabin and the barn. created clear sightlines around the property by trimming back brush, and taught Emma how to use the rifle in case she needed to defend herself. Emma found herself watching him with growing admiration. He was thorough and patient, never condescending despite her lack of experience with firearms. And there was something deeply reassuring about the way he took charge of their defense without ever making her feel helpless or incapable. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Emma finally asked the question that had been on her mind since Reed's visit. "Why are you doing all this, Nash? You could walk away, find work somewhere without all this trouble." Nash was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. "I've spent most of my life walking away, Emma, moving from place to place, never putting down roots. It's a lonely way to live." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "When I took this job, I gave you my word I'd help you. I don't give my word lightly. But this is more than just a job now. Reed is dangerous. You could get hurt." A faint smile touched Nash's lips. "Are you worried about me, Mrs. Willows?" Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm being practical. If something happens to you, I'll be alone again." Nash's expression grew serious once more. "Nothing's going to happen to me, and you won't be alone, Emma. I'll never leave you to face this by yourself. I promise you that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Emma found she couldn't look away from his gaze, couldn't ignore the way her heart raced at his declaration. It wasn't just the promise of protection that moved her. It was the certainty in his voice, the steadfastness that had been so conspicuously absent in Thomas. "Thank you," she said softly, finally looking away. "That means more than you know." The days grew shorter and colder as November deepened toward December. Nash continued to sleep in the barn despite the dropping temperatures, though Emma had renewed her offer of the spare room several times. They fell into a comfortable routine, rising early to tend the animals, working on indoor projects during the day, and sharing quiet evenings by the fire. Emma found herself looking forward to those evenings more than she cared to admit. Nash had proved to be surprisingly well-read for a drifting cowboy, and they often discussed books or current events as they worked on various tasks. He would whittle or repair equipment while Emma sewed or preserved food, their conversations flowing easily in the warm glow of the fire. There had been no further visits from Reed or his men, but neither of them believed he had given up. Nash maintained a vigilant watch, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before Reed made another move. That move came on a bitterly cold night in early December. Emma was awakened from a deep sleep by the sound of Nash's voice, urgent and low. "Emma, wake up. The barn's on fire." She bolted upright, instantly alert. Through her bedroom window, she could see an orange glow illuminating the night sky. "The animals," she began, scrambling out of bed. "I've already moved them to the corral," Nash said, "but we need to try to save the barn if we can." Emma quickly pulled on her clothes and boots, then followed Nash outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow, but the heat from the burning barn was already reaching them as they ran toward it. The fire had started at the far end, away from where the animals had been kept, and was spreading rapidly up the wooden walls. Nash had organized a bucket brigade from the well, and Emma joined the effort, passing buckets of water to Nash, who was closest to the flames. They worked desperately for over an hour, but it soon became clear that the barn couldn't be saved. The best they could do was prevent the fire from spreading to the cabin or other structures. By dawn, the barn was a smoldering ruin. Emma stood staring at the blackened timbers, exhaustion and despair washing over her. Without the barn, how would they shelter the animals through the winter? How would they store the hay and feed? Nash approached, his face streaked with soot, his expression grim. "This wasn't an accident, Emma." The fire started outside the barn, near the hay storage. Someone set it deliberately. "Reed," Emma said, the name bitter on her tongue. Nash nodded. "Almost certainly, this is his way of applying pressure." Tears of anger and frustration welled in Emma's eyes. "What do we do now?" "Without the barn." "We rebuild," Nash said simply. Starting today, we can construct a temporary shelter for the animals using the lumber I've been storing for fence repairs. It won't be perfect, but it will keep them alive until we can build a proper barn in the spring. Emma looked up at him, struck by his determination. You make it sound so simple. Not simple, Nash corrected her. Necessary. Reed wants you to give up, to feel overwhelmed and helpless. We can't let him win. The use of we again warmed Emma despite the cold and her exhaustion. Nash wasn't just her employee anymore. He had become her partner in this struggle, standing beside her against forces that would have overwhelmed her alone. They worked throughout the day, salvaging what they could from the barn ruins and beginning construction on a simple lean-to shelter for the animals. Neighbors from nearby homesteads, seeing the smoke, came to help a reminder that not everyone in the area was as ruthless as Curtis Reed. By nightfall, they had managed to create a basic shelter that would protect the animals from the worst of the elements. The cattle and horses were settled, fed, and as comfortable as they could be under the circumstances. Emma was dead on her feet by the time they returned to the cabin. Her hands were blistered from working with rough lumber, and every muscle ached from the exertion. Nash looked equally exhausted, his face drawn with fatigue. You need to rest, Emma said as they stepped inside the cabin, and you can't sleep outside tonight. It's too cold, and you've been working too hard. Nash hesitated. It wouldn't be proper. Proper be damned, Emma said with uncharacteristic force. You saved my animals, possibly my life. The least I can do is offer you a warm place to sleep. You'll take the spare room, and I won't hear another word about it. A faint smile touched Nash's lips. Yes, madam. As Emma prepared a simple meal, they were both too tired for anything elaborate. She found herself acutely aware of Nash's presence in her home. It was different having him inside, sharing her space in a more intimate way than before. But it also felt right, as if he belonged there. After they had eaten, Nash insisted on taking the first watch, despite his exhaustion. Reed might think we're vulnerable after the fire. I don't want to take chances. Emma wanted to argue but knew he was right. Instead, she brought him a blanket and made sure the fire was well stoked before retiring to her room. Sleep came quickly, her body surrendering to exhaustion despite the turmoil in her mind. She woke several hours later to find Nash gently shaking her shoulder. Emma, he whispered, there are riders approaching, at least 4 of them. Instantly alert, Emma rose and quickly dressed. Nash handed her the rifle he had taught her to use, his expression grave. Stay inside, away from the windows. I'll try to talk to them first, but if anything happens, you need to be ready. Emma's heart pounded with fear, but she nodded resolutely. Be careful. Nash squeezed her hand briefly, then slipped outside, his own rifle ready. Emma positioned herself near the window, staying in the shadows, but able to see what was happening. 4 riders approached the cabin, moving slowly through the fresh snow. In the moonlight, Emma could make out Reed's bulky figure leading the group. They stopped a short distance from the cabin and Reed called out, Barrett, we know you're in there. Come out and talk. Nash stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. It's the middle of the night, Reed. Whatever you have to say can wait until morning. Reed laughed, an ugly sound in the quiet night. I don't think so. We're here to finish what we started with the barn, unless Mrs. Willows has reconsidered my offer. The lady's answer is still no, Nash replied evenly. And if you or your men take one step closer to this cabin, you'll regret it. One of Reed's men moved his horse forward slightly, raising his rifle. There's 4 of us and 1 of you, Barrett. Those ain't good odds. I like my chances, Nash said, his voice calm. First man who fires a shot takes a bullet from me. Might be you, might be Reed. Want to gamble on it? There was a tense silence as the standoff continued. Emma held her breath, her finger light on the rifle's trigger, ready to defend herself and Nash if necessary. Finally, Reed spoke again. This isn't over, Barrett. Not by a long shot. That woman's land will be mine one way or another. Not while I'm breathing, Nash replied quietly. Reed stared at him for a long moment, then abruptly wheeled his horse around. "Let's go, boys. We'll settle this another time." Emma watched as they rode away, their figures gradually disappearing into the darkness. Only when they were completely out of sight did Nash lower his rifle and come back inside. Emma set down her own weapon and rushed to him, relief making her knees weak. "Thank God you're safe." Nash's expression was grim as he secured the door. "They'll be back." Reed's not the type to give up easily. "What do? We can't keep living like this, waiting for the next attack." Nash ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "We need help. Legal help. Reed is powerful in these parts, but even he can't openly break the law without consequences." "The sheriff in Sweetwater is in Reed's pocket," Emma pointed out. "Everyone knows that. Then we go over his head. The territorial marshal has an office in Denver. If we can get word to him about what's happening here, he might intervene." It was a slender hope, but better than nothing. They agreed that Nash would ride to the nearest telegraph office the next day to send a message to the marshal, explaining the situation and requesting assistance. That night, neither of them slept much. They took turns keeping watch, alert to any sign of Reed's return. During her watch, Emma found herself studying Nash as he dozed in the chair by the fire. In sleep, his face lost some of its guardedness, revealing a vulnerability that touched her heart. Who was this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and now risked everything to protect her? Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. After tending to the animals, Nash prepared to ride to the telegraph office in a small settlement about 10 miles away. "I should be back by nightfall," he told Emma as he saddled Buck. "Keep the rifle with you at all times and stay inside as much as possible." Emma nodded, trying to hide her anxiety at the thought of being alone. "Be careful. Reed might have men watching the trails." Nash's expression softened as he looked down at her. "I will." He hesitated, then added, "Emma, if I'm not back by tomorrow morning, I want you to take Sadie and ride to the Peterson farm. They're good people, they'll help you." The implication of his words that something might happen to prevent his return sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "You'll be back," she said firmly, as much to reassure herself as him. Nash mounted Buck, his eyes meeting hers one last time. "I'll do everything in my power to return to you. That's a promise." As she watched him ride away, Emma was struck by how deeply his absence affected her. In just a few short weeks, Nash Barrett had become essential to her life in ways that went far beyond his role as her hired hand. The thought of losing him was almost unbearable. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Emma kept herself busy with chores, constantly alert for any sign of trouble. By mid-afternoon, heavy clouds had rolled in and snow began to fall, softly at first, then with increasing intensity. Emma watched the weather anxiously, knowing that Nash would be traveling in worsening conditions. As darkness fell, the snow showed no signs of letting up. Emma kept a lamp burning in the window, a beacon to guide Nash home through the storm. But as the hours passed with no sign of him, her worry grew into fear. Had Reed's men intercepted him on the road? Had he been caught in the snowstorm, unable to find his way back? The possibilities tormented her as she paced the cabin, alternating between watching out the window and stoking the fire to keep it blazing in case Nash returned cold and wet. By midnight, the storm had developed into a full blizzard, with howling winds driving the snow into deep drifts. Emma knew that no one could safely travel in such conditions. If Nash hadn't found shelter before the worst of the storm hit, he was in grave danger. She was standing at the window, straining to see through the swirling snow, when a muffled sound reached her ears, not the wind, but something else. Listening intently, she realized it was the sound of a horse's labored breathing. Heart pounding, Emma grabbed her shawl and rushed to the door, opening it to a blast of icy air and snow. Shielding her eyes, she peered into the darkness and saw a shadowy figure approaching, a man leading a horse through the deep snow. "Nash," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. The figure looked up, and even through the blowing snow, Emma could see it was indeed Nash. He was covered in snow, moving with obvious difficulty, but alive and somehow, against all odds, he had found his way back to her. Emma waded through the snow to reach him, taking Buck's reins to help lead the exhausted horse to the lean-to shelter they had built. Nash stumbled alongside her, clearly at the end of his strength. Once Buck was safely sheltered with the other animals, Emma turned her attention to Nash. He was shivering violently, his clothes frozen stiff, his face pale beneath a layer of ice and snow. "Let's get you inside," she said, her own teeth chattering from the brief exposure to the elements. She wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting him as they made their way back to the cabin. Inside, Emma helped Nash to the chair closest to the fire. His hands were too numb to undo his coat buttons, so Emma did it for him, peeling off his frozen outer garments and replacing them with a blanket from her bed. "You need to get warm," she said, moving to prepare hot coffee. "You're half frozen." Nash's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "The T-telegraph. I sent it. The marshal said he'd see come." Relief washed over Emma. "Thank God, and thank God you made it back safely. When the storm hit, I was so afraid." Nash reached out, catching her hand as she passed. His fingers were ice cold against her skin. "I promised I'd come back to you." The simple statement, delivered through chattering teeth, touched Emma deeply. She squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. "Yes, you did, and I'm holding you to all your promises, Nash Barrett." A faint smile touched his blue-tinged lips. "All of them." "Every last one," she confirmed, returning his smile through her worry. Emma spent the next hour warming Nash gradually, first with blankets and hot coffee, then with a meal of hearty stew she had kept simmering on the stove. As his body temperature rose, color returned to his face and his shivering subsided. "You could have died out there," Emma said softly as they sat by the fire after he had eaten. "Why didn't you seek shelter when the storm started?" Nash looked up at her, his blue eyes intense despite his exhaustion. "Because I knew you'd be worried. I couldn't leave you alone any longer than necessary." Emma's heart swelled with emotion. No one had ever put her welfare above their own comfort or safety before, not her parents, who had been kind but distant, and certainly not Thomas, who had abandoned her without a second thought. "That was foolish," she chided gently, "but I'm grateful you're safe." Nash smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. "So am I." The blizzard raged throughout the night and into the next day, confining them to the cabin. They spent the time in quiet domesticity, Nash repairing tools and equipment while Emma cooked and sewed. There was something deeply comforting about being snowed in together, a temporary respite from the threats that had been hanging over them. On the second day, the storm finally abated, leaving a pristine white landscape outside their door. The snow lay deep across the property, transforming familiar features into soft, rounded shapes. It was breathtakingly beautiful, but it also meant they were effectively isolated until the roads cleared. "Reed won't be able to reach us either," Nash pointed out as they stood on the porch, surveying the transformed world. "This gives us time until the marshal can arrive." Emma nodded, drawing her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "How long do you think it will take him to get here?" "Depends on how busy he is. A week, maybe 2. Nash glanced at her. "Can you manage being stuck with me for that long?" There was a teasing note in his voice that Emma had rarely heard before. She found she liked it, this glimpse of a lighter side to the serious, responsible man she had come to know. "I suppose I'll survive somehow," she replied with mock seriousness, then smiled. "Actually, it's nice having someone to share the winter with." Last year, Thomas was gone more often than not, even before he left for good. "I spent most of the winter alone." Nash's expression darkened at the mention of Thomas. "He was a fool to leave you, Emma. A damn fool." The vehemence in his voice surprised her. "You didn't even know me then." "I know you now," Nash said simply. "And any man who would abandon a woman like you doesn't deserve a second thought." Emma looked away, her cheeks warming at his words. "Thomas and it was never really a love match. I thought it was at first. He was charming and full of big dreams. But looking back, I think he only married me because he needed a wife to help work the land claim, and when a better opportunity came along. He took it, without regard for his vows or your feelings, Nash finished, his voice tight with controlled anger. Men like that, men who break their promises, they're not men at all in my book. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't speaking only of Thomas. Emma studied his face, wondering again about the past he rarely discussed. "You've been hurt too, haven't you?" she asked softly. Nash was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, a long time ago. Will you tell me?" he sighed, his breath forming a cloud in the cold air. "It's not a very interesting story. I was young, barely 20. She was the daughter of the rancher I worked for in Texas. We fell in love, or I thought we did. She promised to wait for me while I established myself, earned enough to provide for her properly. But she didn't wait," Emma guessed. "No. I came back after a year, with savings and plans for our future, only to find she'd married the banker's son 2 months after I left. Her father had arranged it a much better match than a penniless cowhand." Nash's voice was matter-of-fact, but Emma could hear the old pain beneath the words. "I'm sorry," she said, reaching out to touch his arm gently. Nash covered her hand with his own, a brief, warm pressure. "It was a long time ago, but it taught me to be careful with my trust and with my heart." "Is that why you've never settled down? Because of what she did?" He considered this, then shook his head. "Not entirely. After that, I just never found a reason to stay in one place. There was always another job, another trail, another horizon, until now." The last 2 words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Emma felt her heart beat faster as Nash's eyes met hers, blue and clear and full of an emotion she was afraid to name. The moment was broken by the distant sound of one of the cattle bellowing. Nash straightened, his expression returning to its usual practicality. "I should check on the animals, make sure they have enough feed. This snow might last a while." Emma nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. "I'll come with you. 2 sets of hands will make the work go faster." They spent the rest of the day tending to the animals and clearing paths through the snow to the various outbuildings. The physical labor helped Emma process the conversation they'd had and the feelings that were growing stronger every day, despite her best efforts to keep her guard up. Nash Barrett was nothing like Thomas. Where Thomas had been all charm and big talk, Nash was quiet competence and steadfast reliability. Where Thomas had made grand promises he never kept, Nash made few promises but honored each one absolutely. And where Thomas had seen her as a means to an end, a wife to help secure his land claim, Nash saw her as a person worthy of respect and protection. But could she trust these feelings? Emma had been so terribly wrong about Thomas. How could she be sure she wasn't making another mistake? And even if Nash did return her feelings, what then? He was a drifter by his own admission, a man who had never found a reason to stay in one place. What if he helped her through this crisis with Reed, only to move on once it was resolved? These thoughts preoccupied Emma over the next several days, as they settled into a routine shaped by the snow that still blanketed the landscape. They worked together during the day, sharing the various tasks needed to keep the homestead functioning, and spent the evenings by the fire, talking or reading or simply enjoying companionable silence. Nash continued to sleep in the spare room, maintaining a respectful distance that both reassured and frustrated Emma. There were moments when their hands would touch passing a dish at supper, or their eyes would meet across the room, and Emma would feel a connection that went far beyond employer and employee. But Nash never overstepped the boundaries of propriety, and Emma was too uncertain of her own feelings and his to bridge the gap herself. A week after the blizzard, they were eating breakfast when the sound of approaching horses reached them. Nash was instantly alert, moving to the window with his rifle ready. 3 riders, he reported, his voice tense. Coming up the main trail. Emma's heart raced. "Reed!" Nash studied the approaching figures, then shook his head. No, one's wearing what looks like an official coat. Might be the marshal. Relief flooded through Emma. She joined Nash at the window, watching as the three men drew closer. The lead rider wore a heavy buffalo coat and a wide-brimmed hat, a silver star visible on his chest even from a distance. It is the marshal, Nash confirmed, setting down his rifle. And two deputies, looks like. They went out onto the porch to greet the newcomers. The marshal was a tall, imposing man with a gray beard and shrewd eyes that took in everything at a glance. He introduced himself as Marshal James Harker of the Colorado Territory. "Mr. Barrett," he said, nodding to Nash, "your telegraph message was quite concerning. I came as soon as the weather allowed travel." "Thank you for coming, Marshal," Nash replied, shaking the man's hand. "This is Mrs. Emma Willows, the owner of this homestead." Marshal Harker removed his hat politely. "Madam, I understand you've been having trouble with Curtis Reed." Emma nodded. "Yes, sir. He's been trying to force me to sell my land using increasingly aggressive methods, including burning down her barn and threatening her at gunpoint," Nash added grimly. The marshal's expression hardened. "That's well beyond simple intimidation, Mrs. Willows. That's criminal activity. I'd like to hear the full story if you don't mind." They invited the marshal and his deputies inside, where Emma prepared coffee for everyone, while Nash recounted the events of the past weeks. He explained about Reed's persistent attempts to buy the land, the revelation about the railroad's planned expansion, and the escalating threats and violence. Marshal Harker listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small book. When Nash finished, the marshal turned to Emma. "Mrs. Willows, do you have the deed to your property?" Emma nodded and retrieved the document from the wooden box where she kept important papers. The marshal examined it carefully, then handed it back with a nod. "Everything appears to be in order. This land is legally yours, and no one can force you to sell it against your will." He fixed Emma with a serious gaze. "I want you to know that the law is on your side in this matter. Curtis Reed's actions constitute criminal harassment, attempted coercion, and destruction of property. I have the authority to arrest him and his men." Relief washed over Emma. After weeks of feeling powerless against Reed's machinations, it was immensely reassuring to have the law explicitly on her side. "What happens now?" Nash asked, his stance protective as he stood near Emma's chair. "Now, I pay a visit to Mr. Reed," Marshal Harker said grimly. "Make it clear that his activities have come to the attention of territorial authorities, and that any further harassment of Mrs. Willows will result in his immediate arrest and prosecution." "Will that be enough to stop him?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her. "Reed is a powerful man in these parts." The marshal's expression was resolute. "Reed may have influence with the local sheriff, but he has none with me, Mrs. Willows. I've dealt with men like him before, bullies who think their money puts them above the law. Once they understand there are consequences for their actions, they usually back down." "And if he doesn't?" Nash pressed. "Then he'll find himself in a territorial prison," Marshal Harker said simply. "But first, I'll need your formal statements, both of you, written and signed." They spent the next hour providing detailed accounts of Reed's activities. When they had finished, the marshal rose to leave. "I'll confront Reed today," he told them. "In the meantime, stay vigilant. I'll leave Deputy Collins here as additional protection until this matter is resolved." Emma glanced at Nash, uncertain how he would feel about having someone else take over the role he had filled so capably. But Nash nodded in agreement. "That's wise, Marshal. Thank you." After the marshal and his other deputy had departed, Deputy Collins, a young, serious man with a capable air, took up position on the porch, keeping watch while Emma and Nash returned to their daily tasks. "Do you think this will really be the end of it?" Emma asked Nash as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing the midday meal. Nash considered this. "I think Reed will back down, at least for now. He's a businessman first and foremost. The risk of prison will outweigh his desire for your land." Emma wasn't entirely convinced. He seemed so determined. Men like Reed always have multiple schemes in play, Nash said. He'll find another opportunity to pursue. You're not worth going to prison over. Emma raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure whether to be relieved or insulted by that assessment. Nash smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. You know what I mean. Your land is valuable but not irreplaceable in Reed's eyes. He'll move on to easier targets. They were interrupted by Deputy Collins calling from the porch. Rider coming, just one moving slow. Nash moved to the window, hand instinctively going to his sidearm. Emma joined him, peering out at the approaching figure. It's Marshal Harker, Nash identified the rider. Alone, they went out to meet him as he dismounted, both anxious to hear the outcome of his confrontation with Reed. The marshal's expression was unreadable as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Marshal, Nash greeted him. How did it go with Reed? Marshal Harker removed his hat, brushing snow from the brim. Better than I expected, actually. Reed wasn't happy to see me, but he understood the situation quickly enough. Did he deny his actions? Emma asked. He tried to at first, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that he was simply making a business offer. The marshal's mouth twisted in a wry smile. But when I mentioned the specific dates and times of the incidents, and the names of the men who were with him, he changed his tune. Seems one of his hired hands has a warrant out in Kansas. The threat of me investigating all his employees more thoroughly made him remarkably cooperative. So he's agreed to leave Mrs. Willows alone, Nash pressed. The marshal nodded. He's signed a legal agreement to that effect. If he or any of his men come onto this property again without explicit invitation, or if there are any further attempts at intimidation, he'll face immediate arrest. Emma could hardly believe it was over so simply. And you think he'll honor this agreement? I think he values his freedom and his reputation too much to risk them, Marshal Harker replied. But to be certain, I've informed the territorial governor about the situation. Reed has political aspirations. He can't afford the scandal of criminal charges. The marshal stayed for a meal before departing, taking Deputy Collins with him now that the immediate threat appeared to be resolved. As they watched the lawman ride away, Emma felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that Reed had been thwarted, gratitude for the marshal's intervention, but also a strange sense of anticlimax. It's really over, she said softly, still trying to absorb the reality of it. Nash stood beside her on the porch, his gaze following the departing riders. It seems so. There was something in his tone that made Emma glance up at him. You don't sound entirely convinced. I believe the marshal did his job well, Nash clarified. And I think Reed will back off, at least for now. But men like that, they have long memories and wounded pride. I wouldn't completely let down your guard. Emma nodded, understanding his caution. I won't, but it's a relief to know the law is on our side. Nash's eyes met hers, warm and steady. I'm glad you feel safer now. As they stood together in the cold winter air, Emma realized something important had changed between them. With the threat from Reed neutralized, Nash's reason for staying his employment as her protector was effectively concluded. What would happen now? Would he leave, moving on to his next job as he had always done before? The thought sent a pang through her heart so sharp it was almost physical pain. In the weeks since Nash had arrived, he had become so much more than an employee to her. He was her partner, her protector, her friend, and if she was honest with herself, the man she was falling in love with. But did he feel the same? And even if he did, was he willing to set aside his drifting ways to build a life here with her? These questions preoccupied Emma as they went about their tasks for the remainder of the day. Nash worked as diligently as ever, giving no indication that he was contemplating departure. But there was a thoughtfulness to his manner, a certain distance that hadn't been there before. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Emma finally gathered her courage to broach the subject. Nash, she began, setting aside her mending. Now that the situation with Reed is resolved, I suppose you'll be moving on soon. Nash looked up from the bridle he was repairing, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you want, Emma?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. I assumed you would want to leave. You told me yourself you've never stayed in one place for long." Nash set the bridle aside, his blue eyes intense as they met hers. "That was before." "Before what?" "Before I met you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Emma's heart began to race. "What are you saying, Nash?" He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his. "I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I've found someone worth staying for, if you'll have me." Emma stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Nash, After Thomas, I promised myself I wouldn't trust so easily again." "I know," he said softly, "and I don't blame you for being cautious. Thomas betrayed you in the worst way possible. But Emma, I'm not Thomas. I don't make promises lightly, and I've never broken one yet." "What are you promising now?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Nash's grip on her hands tightened. "I'm promising to stay, Emma, to build a life here with you if that's what you want, to work this land by your side to protect what's yours as if it were my own. I'm promising that I'll never leave you, not for another woman, not for a better opportunity, not for anything." Tears welled in Emma's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. "How can you be so sure? We've only known each other a short time." "Some things you just know," Nash said simply. "I've spent my whole life moving from place to place, never feeling like I belonged anywhere. But from the moment I stepped foot on this land, from the moment I met you, something changed. For the first time, I felt like I was where I was meant to be." Emma searched his face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or deception. But all she saw was open, honest emotion and love. It was there in his eyes, in the gentle way he held her hands, in every word he spoke. "I've been so afraid to trust these feelings," she admitted. "To trust you. But the truth is, Nash Barrett, I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you offered to help me for nothing but room and board." A smile broke across Nash's face, transforming his serious features. "And I've been falling in love with you for just as long. Maybe that's why I rode through a blizzard to get back to you. I couldn't bear the thought of being away from you, not even for one night." Emma laughed softly through her tears. "That was still foolish." "Love often is," Nash replied, reaching up to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "But it's the best kind of foolishness." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Emma had no desire to retreat. Instead, she met him halfway, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a perfect expression of the feelings that had been growing between them for weeks. When they finally broke apart, Emma rested her forehead against Nash's, her eyes closed, savoring the moment. "So what happens now?" Nash took her hands again, his expression earnest. "That depends on what you want, Emma. I meant what I said. I'll stay and work this land with you, be your partner in every way, or if you prefer, I could court you properly first. Though living under the same roof might make that a bit unconventional." Emma laughed. "I think we're well past conventional, Nash. You've already seen me at my worst, covered in mud, crying over spilled milk, cursing at stubborn cattle." "And I've never seen anything more beautiful," he said with such sincerity that Emma's heart melted all over again. "Then stay," she said softly. "Be my partner in the ranch, in life, in everything. I don't need more courtship. I need you, Nash Barrett. I need your strength and your kindness and your unwavering loyalty. I need the man who promised he would never leave me and who I believe with all my heart." Nash's answer was another kiss, deeper and more passionate than the first. It was a promise in itself, a pledge of devotion more binding than any words could be. That night, Nash moved his few possessions from the spare room to Emma's bedroom, a symbolic joining of their lives that felt both momentous and entirely natural. As they lay together in the darkness, Emma's head resting on Nash's chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just a few short months. From the depths of despair after Thomas's betrayal, she had found her way to a happiness more profound than she had ever imagined possible. And it had all begun on that fateful day when a tall, quiet cowboy had offered his help for nothing more than a place to sleep and meals to eat. "What are you thinking about?" Nash asked softly, his fingers gently stroking her hair. Emma smiled in the darkness. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best. If Thomas hadn't left me, you and I would never have met." Nash was silent for a moment, considering this. "I'd like to think we would have found each other somehow, that some things are meant to be, regardless of the path." "Perhaps," Emma agreed, "but I'm grateful for the path that brought us here, thorns and all." Nash pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "So am I, Emma, so am I." Spring came early to the Colorado Territory that year. By late March, the snow had mostly melted, revealing tender green shoots pushing up through the dark earth. The creek ran high with snowmelt, and the first wildflowers began to appear on the sunny slopes. Emma and Nash had spent the winter months planning for the future of their ranch. With the railroad's planned expansion, confirmed a spur line would indeed cross the corner of their property. Bringing with it compensation from the railroad company, they had the capital to expand their operations. Nash had proved to be not just a skilled ranch hand, but a visionary partner, with ideas for breeding better cattle and diversifying their crops. Emma, for her part, had flourished under the partnership, her natural intelligence and determination finding full expression now that she had a true collaborator rather than an absentee husband. They had also begun making plans for their wedding. Though they already considered themselves committed to each other in every way that mattered, they both wanted the formal blessing of marriage. The ceremony was set for early April, a simple affair to be held on their own land with just a few neighbors and the circuit preacher in attendance. On a warm April morning, Emma stood on the porch, watching as Nash worked with one of the new colts they had purchased. His skill with horses was remarkable. The young animal was already responding to his gentle but firm guidance. As she observed him, Emma's hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach, where their first child was growing a secret she had only confirmed the day before and had yet to share with Nash. The discovery had filled her with a joy so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. A child born of love, who would grow up with two parents who adored each other and would never, ever leave. Nash looked up and caught her watching him. He smiled that warm, genuine smile that never failed to make her heart skip and led the colt back to the corral. Once the animal was secured, he walked toward the cabin, removing his hat as he approached. "Good morning, beautiful," he greeted her, leaning down for a kiss. "You're up early." Emma returned the kiss, savoring the moment before pulling back to look into his eyes. "I have something to tell you." Nash's expression grew concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Emma assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Nash's eyes widened, then filled with a joy that matched her own. "A baby, you're sure?" Emma nodded, laughing as Nash swept her into his arms, spinning her around on the porch with exuberant delight. "Careful," she protested, still laughing. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember?" Nash set her down immediately, his expression apologetic but still radiant with happiness. "I'm sorry." Emma, this is the most wonderful news." He dropped to his knees before her, gently pressing his face against her stomach. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "Your mama and I can't wait to meet you." The tenderness of the gesture brought fresh tears to Emma's eyes. She ran her fingers through Nash's dark hair, overwhelmed with love for this man who had brought such joy into her life. Nash looked up at her, his blue eyes shining. "I love you, Emma Willows, more than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." "And I love you, Nash Barrett," she replied softly. "Thank you for keeping your promise. Thank you for never leaving." Nash rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms. "That's one promise I'll keep until my dying day," he vowed. "You and our child, and any others who might come along, you're my home, Emma." and I'm never leaving home again." As they stood together on the porch of the home they had defended and would now fill with family, Emma knew with absolute certainty that her days of weeping over betrayal were behind her. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and secure in the knowledge that Nash's words were not empty vows, but the solid truth on which she could build her life. Her husband's betrayal had indeed left her weeping, until the cowboy said, "I'll never leave." And Nash Barrett had kept that promise, transforming her tears of sorrow into tears of joy, her loneliness into partnership, and her broken heart into one that was healed and whole and filled with love.